So, good morning. We are part of the Society 2045 group, and we're seeking to discover a vision for the year 2045. We're doing it through our work, we're doing it through our words, and today we're interviewing Jose Leal. He's one of our own. He's he's working on a bunch of different things, all related. It turns out, and we want to today see how his work and what he's doing um, supports the cause of 2045. So, so the first thing is, Jose, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background on yourself and on your work. I know we talked the other day about how the different things all tie together and collect the spectrum, and I think that was you should talk about that.
Well, thank you, and it's nice to have my partner in crime be the one that's interviewing me. So, uh, thanks for that, Matt. So, a little bit about myself and what brings me to this space, and basically, from a personal level, born in Portugal, immigrated to the United States as a young kid, and most of my life has been sort of an entrepreneurial mindset. Always started companies, always been moving and doing something new, finding a new thing that's coming along. And it's not until I look back that I realized that, in the 80s, it was about digitizing computer aided drafting from analog drafting. And that's what caught my attention. And that's what I did for 10 years. And then in the 90s, I somehow caught on to this internet space, and it went from analog um, media to digital media. And so that's what I did for another dozen years. And after that work and realizing that I got caught up in the corporate world and the mess that is, over the last 6, 7, 8 years, I've been trying to both understand myself a little bit better, understand humanity a little bit better, and more importantly, um, came across people like yourself and Doug and Kim and so many others who have kind of opened my eyes to the idea that we're in the midst of a transition in how work comes about, but also how all of these institutions come about as a change, a transition that we're doing. And so that's really how I've sort of gotten from being someone that is following uh, transitions to someone that feels himself inside another transition and being a part of that. Um, as far as the work that I'm actually doing, um, it's multi-pronged. We've been working on a book, Matt and I, which hopefully will publish soon, to talk about how we think that the future of work is actually both co-ownership and co-management. It's not just self-management as we've been talking about for some time. Um, at the same time, we've been working on understanding how we move from a paradigm of force, which is what um, our work systems are developed on, and moving towards a paradigm of needs, which comes from humanity itself, our human needs. And how do we then look at the new structures of organizations? So what is this new organization that is based on human needs? And how do we structure that for people to start new organizations? How do we look at that for people to transition their old organizations to a new type of organization? And lastly, I've been working with Yuri Torfs out of Belgium on and others on how do we structure these organizations in from a legal and a financial perspective. So it's all of these things intersect in how does this paradigm change comes about, and and looking at all of these pieces as being pieces that hopefully will contribute to this new vision of 2045.
And what is that vision? What, if you went to sleep today and woke up in 30 years from now, what would it look like?
Um, well, we did an exercise, thanks to Kimberly, that that really shook it out of us. And I think we were all sort of a little shaken, at least I was, by that effort that Kimberly undertook with us. And that was to figure out what we independently were thinking about, because not all of us come from the same space, which is part of the beauty of 2045, is that we do come from different spaces and we see the world a little differently. But we fundamentally hit upon something that I think was really exciting for me, which was that the future of everything, not just the future of work or the future of law or the future of finance and the future of education, but the future of everything is about moving closer to humanity and closer to living our lives from our needs, ourselves, our own motivation, rather than from changing the systems that we currently have that are about force. And so it's, for me, it's seeing work as a place for people to express themselves rather than as a place for people to work. And the expression often comes in the form of beautiful kinds of work that we can't see today because we're forming people through education and through our work system into little, if you will, pawns for the system rather than people who want to actually make a difference in the world.
Okay.
Does that, I'm not sure that answers your question.
No, it does. It does part of it. So it's about relationships as opposed to rules, and I understand that part, and it's all very close to us. The um, the thing that I was looking for is what would the world look like? What would
Thank you.
people? What would it feel like to people?
Yeah, that's
Um,
that's the best way to frame it. Um, I think what it feels like to people is that if I were to paint a picture of a day in the life of someone 24 years from today, um, what I think it looks like as we do this paradigm shift, and not everyone will be there, but I think a lot of people will, is that people will wake up and look around and see what needs to happen, what needs to change, and that's what they will be motivated to do, rather than waking up and thinking, oh, it's 9 o'clock, I have to be at the office in order to do what somebody else wants me to do. And I think that's the difference. I think the difference is that we go from thinking about how do we serve the system to how do we serve humanity. And I think that waking up and feeling that I can understand what's the problem in my community, what's the problem in our society, what's the problem in nature, that those are the things that we all start thinking about rather than the things that we worry about today. How am I going to survive tomorrow? How am I going to keep my job? How am I going to stay employed? And so that's, I think, the big difference.
So how do we get from here to there?
um, I think it's happening. I think we've been going there slowly and we haven't noticed it. Um, I think I've started to recently build a parallel between something that happened 100 years ago and something that's happening today. And I think that parallel is that 100 years ago, we went from, we're 110, 15 years ago, we went from having a couple hundred, 400 cars in the United States built by people who were building these carriages with little engines in them. And realizing that this paradigm was coming, this shift in how we did transportation was about to happen. 20 years later, nobody was buying carriages. Nobody was buying horses. We killed millions of horses across the country because they no longer had utility. And that's the shift that I think we're going from. We're going from a transition from a way of working, because work is a technology, like transportation was a technology. We forget about that. The way we have done work, it's a technology. The structures, the framings, the mindsets, the way we see work is just as much as a technology as the combustion engine was and the car was. And that transition happened like from 1905 to 1925. We went from having a couple of hundred miles of road that was paved to having hundreds of thousands of miles of road that was paved. From having no signage about how to get from place A to place B because nobody was driving, to having hundreds of signs across cities because people were now going beyond just their neighborhood and going in cities to another. So I think that's the level of transition we're talking about. And so how we get there, I don't think is so much about what we are doing, but about the fundamental transformation that our society is taking. And it's that fundamental transformation of people no longer willing to work in organizations and doing gig work and doing contract work and doing, working for themselves in small organizations and freelancing. I think that's already been happening. We just haven't been paying that much attention to it. I think it happens more from there than it does from the work that we're doing in the future of workspace. I think that the future of workspace is just this stopgap for trying to figure out how that's going to happen, rather than the really driving force that's happening.
So besides killing a bunch of horses, which I didn't realize we have to do that now, um, I want you to clarify something because it might sound like, oh, gig work is the way that the change, what the world's going to look like. Everybody's going to be in the zone, and I can easily imagine people listening to this and thinking that's bullshit, that's chaos, that's everybody on their own, that'll never work. I happen to know that you don't mean that, so say a little bit more because one of the things that I see with gig work now is that it's still in the box we call capitalism. It's still in the box of, I own the company and you guys get to move food around for me or people around for me, but it's for me. You're creating wealth for me. So say more.
Yeah, I think that those things, they're manifesting themselves because there's an innate desire that people have to not work in those places of force. And so they're moving towards things that have less force. At least they have some freedom. They're still, as you put it, they're still in that paradigm, but at least they gain a little bit of freedom. And I think that drive towards that freedom, that's really what we're experiencing. That's the thing that's driving this change. It's how people start to feel that they're so forced by the system that they start to move towards new opportunities. And as those opportunities manifest, as they change, as we offer them new things, and they create themselves new things, then that's what's going to happen. So I think it isn't so much that is where we're going, but that's the first steps towards where we're going.
So what is likely to get in the way of that process?
I think the biggest thing that's going to get in our way is that we're going to use force to try to make the change. I think we're going to control it rather than allow it to manifest itself. That's, I think, where we're going to get in our way. We're going to think that we're in charge of this transition, of this paradigm shift, and we're going to try to manage it and to try to control it. And it's not going to happen. It's these things happen They've happened historically. I mean, another one I was a part of, right? Back in 95, when I co-founded AutoNet, there was an industry, a whole industry whose job it was to disseminate information. Mass media, we called it, been around for 100 years. And it went from they controlled who can say what to whom to today, anybody can wake up and log on to Twitter, log on to whatever, and just say what they want to say. There's a lot of issues with that, but at the very least, the people who are doing it feel the freedom to be able to do it. And that's what's happening. All of these things are affecting how especially younger people think about work. How come I can wake up and tell the world what I think about an issue that's happening, but I can't do that in my workplace? I can't do that because I'm not allowed to do that. And that creates that barrier. And so I think the movement is happening from people's inner motivation. And what's going to slow it down is us thinking that it's not about them and their motivation. It's that it's something that we have to control, and it's something that we have to introduce new frameworks for, and it's something that we have to, no, this is something that's happening. The best we can do is create the tools that will serve that thing that's happening.
Okay, so not to fall into a trap of trying to create a future based on the way that we do things today.
Exactly.
Yeah. And what about the ownership? So who owns this, work, and who owns, if everybody's working on their own and doing what they feel is right and what's needed and stuff like that, so it's still the same model of ownership? Is it different?
I think it's kind of crazy that we built. I mean, it's not crazy from an evolutionary perspective, in a historical perspective, but we built this system of the idea that people own other people's work effort. It's kind of like, if you think about it from a just a purely human perspective, it's like saying, well, the tree owns all of the stuff that happens that comes out of the tree, and all of the animals that survive it, the birds that live on it, it's owned by the tree, and the grubs that live in it, they're owned by the tree. It doesn't work that way. It's an ecosystem. And yet somehow we've created this idea that we own people's sweat and effort, that somebody else owns that, and that they own the vehicle that effort manifests itself inside an organization. And I think part of this fundamental shift is that we start to realize that work, meaning the effort that human beings make, is not about it being owned and forced by others, but it being innately driven by our desires, and that we start to manifest efforts collectively together through collaboration rather than through this idea of ownership. So I think the idea of traditional institutions as companies will very rapidly become an old legacy mindset. I mean, we won't be in 26 years. I would hazard to guess that most young people, I'm not talking about most old people who are still entrenched in it and will still be working in it and all of that kind of stuff. I'm talking about the 25-year-old will say, what? They own what I do, right? I create an idea and the patent is owned by the company. I create a product and the profits is owned by the company. I create a piece of art and the copyright is owned by the company. No, that's not acceptable anymore. And we see that happening today already, where people have a sense of ownership of stuff. And blockchain is going to help all of this. And there's a lot of things that are going to be helping in this. But I don't think that the average 25-year-old, 25 years from today, will be accepting of the idea that their work, their effort is going to be owned and capitalized on by someone else. That's just not a possibility for me.
It sounds like a revolution,
I think
right?
it is, but all of these changes that we've experienced are revolutions. 100 years ago, the train companies in the United States owned this country, quite literally. They owned all of the hotels in all the cities west of the Mississippi. They owned most of the towns west of the Mississippi. They owned the roads or the ways of transmitting anything that you wanted to transmit, anything, both from a telegraph line and a rail line. By the 1920s and 1930s, they were gone. They were dead. The train companies were either going out of business or getting bought up by the government so that they could survive. That's how fundamental a change. We went from, in 50 years, from them being the kings of our economic system to being the paupers begging at the government's door, begging to be saved. And I think that's what's happening and has happened with the traditional mass media. And I think that's what's going to happen with our work as we know it. We're going to see the idea of traditional corporations being in the same place that media companies are in the media space, the traditional media space, and the same thing that happened with the train companies 100 years ago. That's how fundamental I think this change is going to be.
Yeah, and I think you're right about that. Obviously, what so looking out at other movements, I mean, there's lots of movements. You throw a stone and you get 20 of them to fly off. So what other movements do you think are more aligned with this vision as opposed to movements that are very narrow and very focused? And maybe you can give us a spectrum of where you think people,
Yeah, I think
these movements
all of
fall.
our movements, wherever direction you point, I think all of our movements are really sort of, um, I think the best way to say it is responding to the same innate drives that I've described. Um, the work of Conscious Contracts, which Kim is a co-founder of, um, there's a need for people to actually work with each other, communicate with each other, to trust each other, to build trust, not in a legal framework or a legal structure, but with each other. And I think that's the beautiful work that's being done in that space. So it isn't that legal is um, building something new for the sake of legal. It's building something new for the sake of this new paradigm. And I think that's true in the movements around human efforts, where people are learning about how to awaken, how to see themselves, how to recognize their own being and what they seek in the world, to people working in new ideas of how do we organize from a digital perspective. So what are DAOs doing? I think they go down this path a little too far away from humanity, but at the same time, they're building a lot of the protocols that will help the human-based systems to work. So some of these movements, I think, they have to go a little too far before they pull back. But traditionally, we've seen this, right? We think that it's a revolutionary change that completely changes things, only to come back to what human needs are. And so, for example, in the web, we thought, oh, digitization is going to change everything, but then we create social media, and it did change everything. It's just not exactly the way we thought it was going to change it, because human beings got into it. And so I think that's the same thing that's happening. I think the blockchain work is fundamentally going to help us, but it's not going to be exactly as it is. I think that legal, in the financial space, in the education space, they're all being driven by the same thing. But I think once they start to work with each other, they'll recognize that they have to serve one another rather than be developing their own visions alone. And I think that's the role that Society 25 is playing, is to bring these different communities together into a unified vision, into a way of communicating um, that is based on the fundamental drivers rather than our individual views of how things should be.
So how it's funny because you were talking, you said um, we go far out and then we come back to more human terms and stuff like that. And in a sense, you can see what um, what happened first in Russia and then the parts of the world with the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and all that. That they had good intentions. I do believe that they had good intentions. Um, but eventually they have to own. They looked around. They said, "Who's going? If the individuals are not going to own this, if royalty is not going to own the fruit of our labors, who's going to own this?" And they were stuck with that mindset, and they decided that the government was going to own this. Um, so, in a sense, to the they went back to a fear-based system, right? In that case, an extreme fear-based system. But um, so, what's preventing us from what won't it happen this time around? That we will go back to a fear-based system. It's like free riders and freeloaders, and we have to avoid those people and take them out of the system. And how do we avoid all that? I mean, what things will get in the way um, with movements behind it? The people that very honestly are convinced that no, people need the help of a strong hand and all that stuff because we're indolent brutes. So
Uh, as you've probably heard by now, I'm a very optimistic person. So I see that those things are potential, but I do believe that that people won't allow that to happen this time. I think it is the power of that. What evolution has been is that we've moved away from power being held in few hands to more hands and more hands and more hands. As bad as today's work situation is, the reality is we've never had more distributed power, right? That when the king held all the power of everything, and not only of the government but all of the institutions and all of the operating organizations and everything else was owned by the king and his minions. At least today, that's much more highly distributed. So for me, I think that that's the trajectory. It will be more distributed, and as it becomes more distributed, um, the power will sit in more and more hands, and that as that happens, um, will prevent the consolidation that's happened in the past. Will it be 100% and will it be clean and perfect and wonderful and all those things? No, I don't think so. It's going to take a long time before evolution clears up a lot of those things, but it will be more distributed. It will be um, people taking it upon themselves because they now have the education, the technology, the tools, the ability to do things themselves. Whereas before, they had to go to an organization in order to be able to do something because they didn't have those things. They were pawns in a system that provided those things. 100 years ago, how do you communicate? Beyond verbal communication between yourself. Well, only corporations had access to the telegraph. Only corporations had access to wealth to be able to make things manifest themselves. Today, a 17-year-old kid can go online, develop a piece of software, and have millions of people use it the next day. That's never been possible before. So I think that's what the difference is. It's you're never going to shut up that 17-year-old kid. You're never going to stop him from doing the things he wants to do. And I think the only thing that we can do as Society 25 and other groups that are working on this is making sure that we're building a vision that's a positive vision for these young people, that they don't go down a path where they have to destroy what we're doing, that they see an opportunity to do something that fits with their energy, that is positive, rather than to simply go around and break what we've got today.
So decentralization is the path that we've been on, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely.
And and yeah, if you follow the path from kings and queens to today, some aspects of that have been more decentralized. Um, However, what enables, and this is the hard question. So what enables, but I think it's an easy answer. So what enables the 17-year-old kid to lighten the 17 lines of code and publish them the next day is this whole setup that we created, the internet and stuff like that. That'll requires a lot of that's been built on a bunch of capital. So somebody had a lot of capital, had been putting it in decentralized ways, right? So AT&T invested, and some of the people invested in Verizon, the rest of it, in creating the pipelines. And um, so they own it, right? They own that process. So at any point they could shut the 17-year-old kid as much as he wants to. He may not have access to it, and you've seen it in smaller countries where the government just decides to shut down and even bigger countries like China, where the government, or what passes as the government, decides to shut it all down. Um, so, what would you say about that? How would you deal with the only vision of what that would look like, and how we can get around that?
I well, so yes, it is a hard question, and no, I don't think it's an easy answer. um, the I think that the fundamental difference between what the government can shut down and what people think they can and should shut down, and the things that create fundamental change, um, they're two different things. I think that the things that create fundamental change are a new worldview. That's what I think creates fundamental change. It's not so much um, the behaviors of a few individuals and so forth. It's this new worldview that gets to a point where it becomes so pervasive that there's a tipping point. And I think that worldview influences everybody, including the people who are against it. But they've succumbed to that worldview as part of just this recognition that that's what's happening and that's what's going to happen. And so if we are trying to change the current system, then the current system will rebel. But if what we're doing is building a new system under a new paradigm, under a new worldview, then it's hard to fight against those things. It's really hard to say the way that people are seeing the world has to be stopped. You can't stop how people see the world. You can only stop when people are trying to interact with the old system and you say, that's not the way it's done and you can't do that anymore. That I think is part of what I think is going to slow us down, is that we still think we need to change the system that exists, and we don't. We need to create a new system that's parallel to it, that over time replaces the one we've got.
Yeah, and that's a great answer, by the way, because it is it reminded me of the whole thing of the Declaration of Independence in this country. Um, so I joked that it was an intervention from outer space, um, because it was a very different worldview, totally imperfect, right? These people were talking about the world created equal and they own slaves, they own people, and stuff like that. But that seed that he put it in everybody's head was a mechanism whereby we're at the point we're at today, where things are a lot better and getting better in a hurry. So I think you're on the right track for that. Um, so what happens if this doesn't happen? What happens if we get all put in jail and I don't know, whatever, sent to a gulag or something, or
Well, I don't know. If we're going to be put in jail, I vote you first. Uh, um, it's too distributed for it to be that kind of thing. Where I think there will be some of that, but I think it'll be small. But I think there is a risk that we somehow get lost. That all of this energy gets misplaced. I think the energy is there. There's no question about that. It's whether it gets placed in the right place or not. And if it gets misplaced, then I think that's the risk. Um, and if it gets misplaced, I think it will be an effort by the status quo, the current paradigm, to hold on to power, um, and and that will always happen. But I think it will be the failure of people like ourselves to not work on the new paradigm and instead fight it, the current one. I think that's how we get there. Is we get to the point where we think that the problem is fixing the thing we've got and changing the thing we've got, and that's the only way that the system actually stops from doing the shift. And that, to me, is the risk. And if not enough of us in this space of the future of everything, as I like to call it, if not enough of us are focusing on this vision and this understanding that it is coming from all of us, and that all we need to do is facilitate it, not create it, but facilitate it, then we will be fighting each other, and we'll be fighting the system, and we will lose. So
great.
if it happens, which I hope it doesn't, and I hope that that's part of what we can do, is bring out that conversation to the world. If it does happen, then I think it will be slowed down. And so 2045 is not going to be a vision that we see, but that maybe it's 2075, or 2100. But I think one way or another, it's going to happen. It's just, are we going to have a lot more suffering in the process or less suffering in the process?
Well, thank you very much. We're pretty much out of time here, and this was great. I don't know if it works for anybody else, but it certainly worked for me.
No,
So
I think it was wonderful. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, not only for having the good questions, but also for helping me see a lot of this stuff over the last few years as we've worked together. Because you were doing this stuff way before a lot of us were. So kudos to you and a lot of people like Kim and others that have been doing a lot of this stuff for years. And so, as much as any of us who are working on this today can take credit for the work that we're doing, I think it's the fact that we've been able to learn from the people who are the real pioneers over the last 10, 15, 20 years that have really done the hard work. So thanks to you guys.
thank you.